All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, or depending on where you are today. I'm Alice. I'm the Education Committee Chair for WAPOR, and my day job at Stanford, as you see my background. I'm very excited this morning here in California to introduce Andrew. He and I have known each other for a while now, but his work is so inspiring. You know, um, he co-founded this company you may know of called Remesh, but really, I think a lot of his work and the reason why he spends a lot of time in this space is to use the technology to do a lot of interesting and valuable and good work that has really changed how we think about public opinion and how we think about collecting public opinion in places that are really difficult and maybe places that people feel like there's no hope. And in learning about all the different ways that he's been using technology to bring hope, I thought it would be really important just to have WAPOR be a venue where he can share his projects, his learnings, and for all of you to see whether these are things that you can deploy in places that you're thinking about and that you care about deeply. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining this morning, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alice, and pleasure to meet those of you whose names I can see scrolling next to me in an attendee list. I'll note sort of as I go here, I'm going to orient this around kind of taking you through the past 2 years of work we've been doing in Israel, Palestine. It'll start a bit academic, just because I want to maybe have interesting conversation around where this comes from, what it's anchored in, and how we arrived at these different methods. And then I'll sort of like accelerate time and walk us through over the past year or so where things have been more closely integrated into diplomatic processes. I'll note along the way, feel free to ask questions. I'm not sure the mechanic of how it will work here on this webinar, but I'm happy to sort of take some things as we go, and I will augment, speed up, or slow down the kind of content I've got here today based on where the conversation goes. All right, so I'm going to start here. Give me 1 second just to orient my screen. Um, all right, so I want to sort of just anchor us when I use a few words here. I'm not sure how many folks here come from a background in diplomacy or peace building, so just introduce a few terms I'll use. So core ideas here to be aware of is this idea of track 1, 2, and 3 dialogues. If you think of track 1 dialogue as the sort of formal diplomacy that usually happens between governments and sometimes involves a mediator. Track 2 dialogue that typically happens between peace builders or members of civil society. Track 3 dialogue is sort of everything else that involves residents. And the way that information flows up and down these channels during peace building activities is usually determinative in how well they will play out. The UN often will sit here and help with track 1 dialogues as a facilitator, but often will then sort of like connect themselves down into track 2 and 3 dialogues along the way. This is relevant because since about 2020, we've been working with the UN, and most of the times that we would run collective dialogues, which I'll introduce here in a bit, would be to help connect folks at the UN directly with residents on the ground as they went and ran sort of these formal processes along the way. And we've deployed this now across maybe 10 different UN missions and a whole bunch of other special diplomatic projects. I forget the formal name here, and maybe run about 50 to 60 different collective dialogues with the UN as part of broader peace building. So that is the backdrop of which we entered into 2024, coming out of 2023, which is this pattern of what we think we can do is run collective dialogues, find common ground across residents, and push it into track 1 dialogue. And in the wake of October 7th, the UN no longer was able to play a role for reasons I won't get into here between the Israeli and Palestinian folks. And so our thinking was to shift from working and focusing with the UN to, in this conflict, focusing on peace builders. And so luckily, someone who may be here, helped us identify the Alliance for Middle East Peace as an organization of organizations. So they are organization that brings together a bunch of different civil society and peace building organizations on the ground in the region on both sides of the conflict. And so I went to them and I said, hey, I'd like to do this thing that we've been done, 50, 60 times with the UN, which is to help identify common ground across residents. And then let's push it up through your peace building folks, and we can advocate for it into the folks who are in power to make decisions. What I learned, though, and in retrospect should have been obvious, is that it was a very tense time coming out of 2023. And even among the peace building folks, it sort of felt a little bit inappropriate to even ask them to engage with each other, much less the residents. And so this shifted the goal from finding common ground across the residents to instead, initially, creating a way to bring peace builders back together and find common ground across them so that we could go and advocate for this on their behalf globally. So this is the focus. Let's find common ground across peace builders and reboot productive dialogue. I'll sort of bury the lead here, or I won't bury the lead and say the punchline of what I'm going to spend the next maybe 25, 30 minutes going through is to arrive at this joint letter on behalf of both Israeli and Palestinian peace builders that went to world leaders about halfway to the back half of 2024. So let's dive into how we went from where we were at the start to getting to here. So I'm going to break this down into basically three different pieces that I'll compose together to give a picture of the overall approach. So first, I'll explain what collective dialogues are. Then I'll explain how we use collective dialogues to find common ground. And then finally, I'll show how we use the process to find common ground and integrate it into a deliberative processes to do something recursively until we can achieve what we are aiming for. All right, so collective dialogues. You can think of a normal dialogue. I use this word very colloquially. It's like the back and forth exchange between two people. And when I say collective dialogue, I basically mean scaling up this dynamic to an arbitrarily large group of people or a population. Mechanically, this involves a back and forth exchange between a moderator and all of the participants that can involve polls or messages, involve collective response processes, most importantly, where participants are going to respond, vote on the responses of others, and then we're going to use AI to integrate, synthesize, and bring that information together to identify what best represents them. Usually, we'll construct a collective dialogue in a few different phases. So it'll happen over the course of maybe 30 minutes to an hour. As participants on board, we'll collect their demographics. Then we'll go through a period of education and deliberation with the idea of bringing them up to be maximally informed on the topic that we're talking about. And then we'll do targeted elicitation where we ask for their input directly on the thing we aim to understand their point of view on. This is what the experience looks like on Remesh. So you enter, you give your demographic information, and then immediately you're in a conversation that looks basically like a text message or chat conversation. Then within that conversation, once you get to a collective response prompt, you'll see an open-ended text box where you can respond with your answer to whatever the prompt is. You'll respond, and then you'll start voting on the responses of others. This will include agree or disagree votes, along with pair choice votes like A, B, A, or B. And we'll collect about 10 of those per participant per collective response prompt. But if those of you who are doing the math, if we're doing this with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people, and we're only getting 10 votes per person, then that means we have an extremely sparse sampling of what participants' actual votes. And so to sort of fill in the gaps, we use a prediction model. So we base it on a utility model of choice. I won't talk through the math here, but put it up so you know where it comes from. And then by writing down the utility of any one response to any one participant as determinative of the probability that they choose it over something else or that they agree with it, we can then pull that into an LLM augmented latent factor model. And this lets us do prediction using all the data we have, including the content of the messages, to then predict all of the votes that we don't have. It's not perfect, but the single vote prediction accuracy is somewhere in the order of 75 to 80%. And for those of you who are saying that's not the right question is, what happens when we aggregate those together? What is our one standard deviation, or what does our confidence range look like? It gives us about a one standard deviation confidence that usually lands between 1 and 4% when we aggregate over that data. And this comes from posterior variance from bootstrapping for those. Okay. So once we do all of that, we can then integrate together those predicted votes and the real votes with the demographic data. And this lets us make a good estimate of the overall agreement that every single participant demographic group has across every single participant response. And this is important because one, we can show back to participants how well people likely agree with their response, which can be a good normalizing force. We can show participants the overall sort of most representative responses so they understand what the group is thinking. And then the conversation is going to flow from there, usually involving maybe 10 to 15 different ones of these collective response prompts and voting. But all of this now sort of I'll abstract away to say when we run these, what we have to design going in are the collective dialogue prompts and the overall flow. Over the course of the collective dialogue, we end up getting a bunch of these statements with an assessment of how well those statements resonate or are agreed upon by the different groups that we care about. In this case, often defined either within a population or across multiple populations. All right, so that's collective dialogues. Now I'm going to abstract collective dialogues away and go to how we use them to find common ground. So we'll start here. And what we want to be able to do is we want to identify bridging statements among all of the things that participants submitted. So this means we want to find the statements where people on all sides of the conflict or on different sides of a political division all actually agree on it. So these are sort of, we want to find those needle in a haystack ideas that actually represent consensus. So to do that, in this case, we use two different types of bridging algorithms. The first we call deliberate bridging or max-min agreement. Basically, we are going to compute a floor. So we're going to look at the groups that we care about. So to simplify here, let's say Israelis and Palestinians, and we're going to compute the minimum agreement across any of them. So that is to say the number that means no less than this fraction of either Israelis or Palestinians agree with this response. And we're going to rank by that. And so this gives us a nice way of saying we'll set a floor, and anything above that floor means no less than that percent of either group agrees with this. The other algorithm we'll use is continuous bridging. So this is the same algorithm that is used by X community notes that autonomously finds the axes of maximum division among participants and then finds the responses that have the highest amount of agreement decoupled from that axis. Again, I won't go into the math here, but you should look it up if you are curious. The result of it, though, is that we are able to put these things together and use them to identify out of all of this data where there are statements contributed by participants to the prompts we design that represent consensus. And so they're pretty good, but as you might imagine with a bunch of human data, there's a lot of redundancy. They are not perhaps the most perfectly articulated versions of these statements. And so what we do as a next step is to distill those into collective statements that manifest the core unique ideas across the points of consensus and then articulate them as accurately as possible. So preserving the phrasing and wording of the original statements, which is very important when dealing with different languages and dialects, and that best represent the group. And so to do this, we use an LLM distillation pipeline. So we take in the bridging statements, we identify the concrete ideas, we give it examples of the structure that we're looking for a collective statement, and then we pull all of that together to generate distilled statements that are still in the language and phrase choices of participants that had common ground, but are now synthesized into atomic units. And that gives us collective statements. I'll note that at this point, normally we would say we have pretty high confidence already that these are going to represent common ground among the group. But especially in a context like peace building, you have to have legitimacy. And so the last step that we do is we run a final vote on these collective statements. And importantly, this involves zero AI. So while we did a lot of AI stuff to get to that point, for the final step, we remove all the AI and we do good old-fashioned vote. In this case, we did two types of votes. One is the absolute vote, asking whether or not people agree with it, and the other is a ranking vote to understand how people prioritize between different things. And I'll come back to show how we use these data points a bit further on. So this is the overall flow of what we use as a way to start with nothing and end with a set of validated collective statements that represent common ground across the groups. Lastly, though, I'll note that, as I alluded to, there's some decisions that get made along the way here that are tricky. So designing the dialogue points is creating or designing human language that you're going to ask. This is an opportunity that bias or either accidental on purpose could enter and sort of pollute or invalidate or delegitimize the results all the way down the stream. And so at this juncture and a few other key junctures along this process, we would have a joint review of the prompts, a joint review of the collective statements, and even a joint review of the final results, facilitated by Alliance for Middle East Peace, involving at least one Israeli and Palestinian during that process to make sure that sort of things stayed neutral along the way during this process. All right, so that is the process to find common ground. Now, let's talk about how we integrate that into an iterative, deliberative process to achieve what we are looking for. So in this case, I'm going to do another layer of abstracting up. So that whole thing that I noted that I said we use to find common ground, it's now going to become this blue box that says common ground process. And you'll see it now integrated into a dialogue cycle, which involves running the common ground process and then pulling together a group with folks on either side to discuss and sense make around those results. All right, so the way that we went about doing this was, again, because it wasn't perhaps appropriate or the right time, or like the foundations weren't in place to ask people from all sides to come into a dialogue together, we started by building up over time, running first uninational dialogues to help set the substrate so that a joint dialogue could take place once we could get to cycle 4. And the idea of these uninational dialogues was to help identify the values, vision, and red lines that would be the substrate for a joint dialogue going forward. And so the values was sort of, we were hoping that there would emerge values that were common among each group and across each group that sort of set the baseline, that there was a vision for the future that would be shared, and that there would be clarity about what the red lines were across these different groups in order to feel comfortable entering into a joint dialogue together. So we started with Israeli Jews and ran this first dialogue cycle in Hebrew. So I'll flag a few things that came out of this. So first is the red lines for the outgroups, meaning the red lines that the Israeli Jews would have for the outgroup, so maybe the Palestinians. So harming Israeli citizens, they considered crossing a red line, calling for destruction of Israel, considered a red line, justifying the attack on October 7, considered red line. On the flip side, we asked their red lines for themselves, meaning the red lines they would hold their fellow Israeli Jews to during dialogue. So this meant they would say that harming Palestinians would be considered crossing a red line, Palestinian citizens as a red line, talking about deporting Palestinians would be crossing a red line, and depriving human rights would be a red line. So this helped us set the substrate to run the next dialogue, which was with the Palestinians from occupied territories. This we would run in Palestinian Arabic. I won't go into in depth here, but there's like a whole other set of things we did to like test our systems to make sure they would work in these dialogues, which are not as common on the internet as English, which is what AI gets trained on. And so as that, we found similar things in terms of what these red lines were. So calls for forced displacement would be a red line, abolishing the existence of the other, not recognizing rights of Palestinians, red line. And then the flip side, which is the red lines they would hold to themselves, such as human rights violations, refusing to recognize the Israeli side, or supporting or justifying violence. I think sort of we didn't anticipate this, to be honest, but it ended up sort of nice that there was a degree of maybe not equivalency, but of alignment between the in-group and out-group red lines across these groups. So for example, the Palestinians would say it would be a red line if the others called for forced displacement, while the Israeli Jews said it would be a red line that they would hold themselves to if they were to talk about deporting Palestinians. And so this helped set a nice beginning point for a collective dialogue. And the same was true sort of in the flip side. So harming Israeli citizens was a red line, and justifying or supporting violence was a red line Palestinians had for themselves. So these sort of emerged as a set of things that could help us reaffirm a good substrate to be able to have joint conversation under. Then we ran a third dialogue with Palestinian citizens of Israel who are sort of belong to both of the first groups, but don't properly belong to them. We wanted to give them their own unique voice as part of this process. And so after we ran all three of these, we then looked at where we found common ground within each group related to values, and then looked at if there was a pattern across those three groups on this. I won't read through all of the text on the screen other than to say the shared values that came out of this were peace, equality, and human life. And when we looked at where there was a shared vision for things they wanted to be true about the future, it involved independence, safety, and prosperity. And so all of this set the stage so that we can now bring these groups together to have the first joint dialogue at the scale since October 7th. And this would take place simultaneously in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. So I'll note here, because this was going to now be trilingual, that we had to be very careful around how we handled language. Because the dialogue prompts, the statement and votes, the collective statements, the final results, all of these things would have to exist in all languages. And everyone would have to trust that the way that this translation took place was fair and equitable. And so this involved a combination of a few things. So multiple points here would just start with Google Translate, which would get us pretty close. For the dialogue prompts, we didn't necessarily trust this. And so we would actually have someone, native speakers from all sides who spoke at least two of the languages to like validate or correct to make sure there was alignment sort of across these three languages in the dialogue prompts. When we run these live, we rely on Google Translate, and we're very upfront with participants to say, we're using Google Translate. This is going to be imperfect. And if you see something that looks a little imperfect, you know why. Also, try to use language that you think is like not too strong with things that you think are likely to not translate well. So we just try to be upfront about it. Worked reasonably well. And then for collective statements, we used LLMs to do the initial translation, which we're at this point already becoming quite good at it. We still have human joint review because the stakes are pretty high. And then we run a human joint review on the final results, including even the labels for like the different graphs, because we want there to be no ambiguity about it being fair in the way that we are communicating information. Second problem we had to solve in running a joint dialogue is that we didn't want to be exclusionary. So we didn't want to say, so many people from this group can come, there's a quota, and as soon as we meet those quotas, everybody else is like excluded. So we wanted it to be inclusionary because it was important for legitimacy. But we expected, for logistic reasons, population size reasons, and sort of the dynamics of asymmetry, that we would have a larger group of Israelis who would participate than we would necessarily Palestinians who are in the midst of a unpleasant situation. And so that means that we had to think about how we design the metrics that we were going to use in a way where we would call equal power, meaning that each group had equivalent influence over the final result without the assumption of having equivalent number of participants. And so we did this for three different types of social choice metrics. I'll go through them briefly. But we'll label them bridging agreement, Borda score, and IRV rank. Two of these you've probably heard of. So the bridging agreement score is basically what we used as part of the common ground process. We look at the amount of agreement across these three groups, and we take the minimum of it. It's a very simple metric, and it basically means no less than this percent of any one of these three groups agrees with this thing. So it means no matter how many you have, each group has equivalent influence. The second thing we used was a Borda score. So a Borda score, for those who are not familiar, basically means you have people rank things. You assign an amount of points for each rank. So points for rank number 1, 0.5 points for rank number 2, 0 for rank number 3. And then you do a weighted sum of the number of people who ranked it in each position multiplied out by the scores that you assign. And you can do that over all of the statements, in our case, all of the collective statements that we had in these groups of collective statements. And so then to make this be equal power, we would actually compute the score individually within each one of these three groups, and then we would average it across those three groups to get a final Borda score. So again, so it became invariant to the fraction of participants in each one of those groups. And then lastly, was to come up with an IRV rank. So this is an instant runoff vote, or you might have heard of it in the context of ranked choice voting. And the idea here is that you basically run rounds of elimination. And so during round 1, you're going to eliminate the collective statement that has the lowest number of people who ranked it number 1. Then anyone who did rank it number 1, their number two choice becomes their number one choice, and you recompute this and do this until you've eliminated all of them, and then the reverse order that you did this elimination in gives you the rank. I won't go into the reasons why this is robust, but the social choice theorists in the group will appreciate this. It has a lot of nice properties that mean that we can trust it under a lot of imperfect conditions. But again, to make this equal power, we had to basically do normalization within each one of these synthetic rounds. And so that meant that we would actually compute the fraction of people who ranked it first within each group independently, and then again, average across them so they each have equal contribution to the overall weight and to these elimination with each one of these rounds. In the end, that got us to this final score. All right, so now we're sort of set up. We can run this in different languages. We feel robust to imperfection in the ratios of participants. And so now the key question is, put a lot of work to get here. What should we focus this conversation on? So I'll note here, ALMEP has relationships both sort of up the stack, meaning with governments running formal diplomatic processes, and their civil society groups have relationships down the stack with the residents on either side of this region. And so where we landed was that two of the things, at least the ones I'll talk about here, that this conversation focused on was developing a joint message to world leaders that they could advocate for to world leaders, and developing joint messages to residents that they could collectively communicate down to their resident constituencies. I'll sort of skip to the results here for the purpose of time. So here are the joint demands to world leaders, including the IRV rank, the Border score, and the bridging agreement. Note that this is happening during about mid-2024. And so the top joint demand was an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages. You can see that the bridging agreement was really high across all of these. So it meant that no less than 90% of the Israeli or Palestinian participants agreed with any of these five things, but you can see that the Border score tells us that one of these was consistently ranked number one above all the rest, which was an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages. I won't read through the rest of them, but this sort of set up the rest of these that were the top 5 points of common ground that came out that went into the letter that I showed you at the beginning that began being advocated for with folks in power. The second thing that came out of this was these joint messages to residents that involve things like condemning violence and promoting human dignity, pressuring governments, ending occupation, etc. You'll note here, bridging agreement, again, quite high, the lowest being 84%. But the Border scores in this case were much smoother. So 50, 47, 49, 43. And so they give a much subtler, there's not clearly one thing that stands out as the number one thing. Although there does seem to be a thing that was ranked near the end consistently. All right, so I'll note this was sort of getting us to the point of, and I presented all of this through the lens of like an information system where we're doing research and we're just trying to get these outputs that are informational representations of common ground across these groups of people where most people assume there are none. But I think it's important to note that these are real people going through a very tough situation. And so we do think a lot about what effect participating has on them and whether or not it's positive. So I put a few quotes up here, which is indicative of what we'll see maybe 60% of the time, which is people generally have a positive view of it. So they'll note it being something that gives them hope. They'll note that the anonymity of it means that they can share their perspective without being judged or fearful of harm, which is often a real concern in conflict zones. And I think one that actually surprised me was people noting that they felt lots of self-reflection as participating in part of this, which is not something that we would always see. All right, so this is sort of the overly cartoonified version of the year of over 2024, which was we started in this state of focusing on how can we help bring groups back together, find common ground between them. And we ended having brought them back together, found common ground in terms of messages to leaders and residents that then could be advocated for. And all of this is happening with the help of ALMEP, who are sort of doing this advocacy and bringing all of these groups together. All right, so sort of brings us through the end of year one, where we'll found common ground, help reboot productive dialogue, and guide how they're going to collectively approach solutions. Now I'm going to transition into 2025. Well, I'll put this up here. If you're more curious about the technical details and research details and doing everything that I just talked about, I would encourage you to read this paper with some of my brilliant co-authors, which include both an Israeli and a Palestinian as co-authors on the paper. For the same reasons we talked about across a lot of this, along with folks from Harvard and Stanford. All right. So before I go in any more depth and sort of talk through 2025, I want to provide a very strong like pre-warning disclosure that hopefully with this group is maybe less important, but this is a correlation does not equal causation point, which is to say, as I present sort of what happened over the course of 2025, I want to be very clear that we don't ever know what is the causal linkage between the things that we do and the eventual outcomes that happen with world leaders. And so, well, I'll present this in a way which sort of shows the time sequence of events happening and shows there to be a sort of, very clear correlation between the will of various peoples and the actions that world leaders take. I want to say with resounding clarity, we're not saying these are for sure causally linked. I hope all of you can appreciate that the world of diplomacy has a lot of rooms that we do not get to be in, and so we just don't know how those things connect. All right, so that's the asterisk we'll start this with, and I'll try not to keep saying that all the way through. All right, so the plan then entering 2025 is that we wanted to scale this approach up to start bringing in a broader group of people. So to go beyond peace builders to civil society leaders, and then eventually to go beyond civil society leaders to the public writ large, which is sort of easy on one side of this equation with Israelis and was very hard on the other side with Palestinians. I don't actually have slides in depth here, but I will note that it took about 9 to 12 months of effort working with a partner on the ground to actually get to a point where we could reliably source Palestinian participants that were representative across both Gaza and the West Bank. So that's a very, very, very hard problem that I'll sort of brush over here, but I want to state that is probably the hardest thing to have solved out of all of these things put together. All right, caveats out of the way, let's move on. If you recall, one of the demands to joint leaders that came out of 2024 was to include civil society and NGOs in peace building discussions. And one world leader decided to do this in a very literal way. So President Macron, about halfway through last year, about end of May, made this decision that he was going to fly in a representative group of civil society leaders of Israelis, Palestinians, and Palestinian citizens of Israel to Paris to host a Paris Peace Forum to try and sort of jumpstart and create the substrate that would put pressures to set in motion something that they hoped would end with a peace deal. Note, this is at the time when there were still hostages held in Gaza and a whole lot of violence going on. So Macron brought this group together, but a few days before this, we decided that with this group of civil society leaders, we were going to try and run that same process that we would run in a very abridged and shortened rapid fashion over 3 days to help find common ground among them that could then feed into the Paris Peace Forum and the sort of agreements that would come out of it. So you'll see this is the same thing I've already presented. We ran a collective dialogue. We ran it online, basically as people were boarding airplanes to come over. We found the statements. We found those that had consensus across these 3 groups. We distilled that down, and then we ran a final vote the night before they hosted the Paris Peace Forum to find the sort of short list of things that they agreed on. These included things that were both demands to governments, like this is what we collectively believe we all need, as well as civil society initiatives that they could collaborate on that they thought would help improve the likelihood of achieving peace overall. So these flowed into the Paris Peace Forum that involved a bit of sort of classic deliberation and people in rooms and talks. And the final output of this was three things. The first is the Paris call for the two-state solution. The second is a set of detailed recommendations for UN working groups that we're going to meet in a couple months or a couple weeks. And the last were detailed plans for civil society and how they might execute on some of these initiatives. So these things then got fed into the UN and in July, so about a month later, the Saudis and the French hosted this summit in the UN at the UN, where they developed the New York call on two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, which is sort of like the next rev on what was developed in Paris. Um, that sort of set in motion going up into the UN General Assembly in August and September. And I'll note that is around this time, I think, where everyone was arriving at the realization very seriously that the only way that this deal would likely come together is if it was led by President Trump. And so coming into the UN General Assembly, we basically focused on figuring out what the will of the various people around the scenario was that we could communicate with President Macron ahead of him meeting with President Trump. And so this involved both the American voters, which is something that we assume President Trump is attuned to, as well as Israeli and Palestinians. I won't go into too much of the details of the content of that for the purpose of maybe respect and security at the moment. But out of that came, at that UN General Assembly, came the initial announcement of an agreement to end the war in Gaza. But this initial agreement was basically with Arab leaders broadly, and then with the Israelis sort of informally at the White House. And immediately after this happened, there was a waiting time to see how Hamas would respond. And I'll note that there was lots of less than nice things said about what would happen if they did not simply accept the deal that was at hand. And we wanted to then understand, sort of in the few days of this window, while we waited for Hamas's response, what the American public would ultimately want Trump to do. And so we ran a set of these sort of dialogue processes in an abridged form, identify that sort of under either circumstance where they came back and said, we sort of provisionally agree, but we want changes, or we just don't agree, that the American people overwhelmingly would like for Trump to still keep negotiating as the great negotiator. And so we communicated that information over to them. On October 7th, October 3rd, Hamas came back to say yes, but we don't fully agree to everything. And then by October 3rd and 4th, Trump basically welcomed that response with positivity, even though initially saying there would be horrible outcomes, and continued to negotiate until on October 8th, they signed the initial ceasefire deal. And then by October 13th, the Israeli hostages were freed, and sort of everyone began celebration. I'll note at this point, we then tried to start understanding from Americans where they would see success in Trump's efforts on this. Our assumption was he wanted to be successful, and we wanted to help them understand where Americans would see like the breakpoints to build up towards that success, including not just the deal being signed, but actually the next steps like prisoner and hostage exchange, and then after that, near-term measures like actually laying the foundation for peace, which includes setting up like the civil society transitional government and all of these other pieces that were yet to happen. I'll note this brings us to about November 2025, where though there is some optimism because there's been a deal struck and the hostages were released, sort of everyone who has worked on this for any period of time had this prevailing opinion, which is that they're unsure if the peace would last because there's a lot of things still to get right. I should maybe update this, but as of then December 2025, if we sort of full circle back to those initial 5 joint demands to world leader and ask where are we on this? So immediate ceasefire, release of hostages. This one is done. Recognizing both sides' trauma. This you actually heard a lot in the media happening around this, including civil society and NGOs and peace building discussions. This definitely happened. Now there's 2 things that I'm not sure of how we would characterize them even now, but they're in progress as we speak. I'm not sure what's been announced, and that is the long-term international fund to build foundations for a long-term solution and creating a globalized coalition. So I think this is the state of where we are. I'll note that even as we speak, these cycles now continue. So this is sort of an ongoing effort that is now scaled up to populations where we're running these processes basically every single month and feeding them into all of the corners of where the decisions are being made that will determine the future of these 2 peoples living next to each other. So I'll end it there and maybe take some questions before moving on. Or actually, I guess I'll briefly put this up to say behind the scenes on all of this was this platform we developed called Remesh, where we were running all of the collective dialogues, sort of in all of the data collection stuff that you saw. So this is not the only use case for it. We actually, like, the business is built in market research, but we use it a lot for bringing in democratic public will into high stakes decision with folks like the UN, the White House, OpenAI, and others. All right. I'm not sure how to get to questions, but if there are any, I will take them now. All right, I see one here. So were there intentional efforts to recruit Palestinian participants from both Gaza and the West Bank, and were those groups separated for analysis? Yes and yes. So when we want to get a representative group of Palestinians, basically the way that we do this is we break down the West Bank and Gaza into governorates. I believe there's about 13. We look at the population that was like most recently understood to be in each of those governorates, and then we get like that number of people in each one of those governorates stratified across age and gender. And so that involves both governorates in the West Bank and governorates in Gaza. Governorates in the West Bank are a little tricky because, as you can imagine, there's been quite a bit of migration since the last proxy for or census or something that's been there. And so we have to use a little bit of best judgment to assess what's reasonable. And then in analysis, we both will look at them jointly as one, and we'll look at them separately as two across those two regions and just sort of present both of those pictures.
I see that Elena Koneva has her hand raised. Andrew, are you comfortable with letting her speak her question?
Of
Of course, I'm going to allow you to talk, Elena.
Hello to everyone. And first of all, I want to say that it is absolutely fantastic work. And in my mind, this is a top of a research dream to become a piece of actionable posterness, how I call it. And so I'm from Russia, but I'm doing research in Russia and Ukraine, of course, related to the war, to the conflict. And I have 24 of questions, but now I will ask most important for me, most applicable. From all your experience, which is now, I think that maybe unique experience, can you imagine, and just to say your opinion, is it theoretically possible to implement this experience? Maybe some part of it, some fragments, and in Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I have a few times my discussion with Irving Collin, and I may tell you that I try to explain to him that it's not possible to implement all sort of peace polls and so in Russia-Ukraine, because Israeli-Palestinian conflict is what I called symmetric conflict, because there are things from both sides. It's a long story, which one. But in Russian-Ukrainian conflict, in the war, it's not symmetric situation at all. And that's why I wonder, could we implement something to help to push the truce process, the peace process in that war?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll sort of be careful in how I answer it because, again, I'm a theoretical physicist by background, and then I spent a decade running a tech company and then applying the software in these worlds. And so while I have a lot of experience, I would not say that experience extends to the formalities of war and negotiation at the very top levels. I'm always sort of the outside group of people in the rooms where this would happen. But the thing that I'll note here is that I think there's two parts that you need to be true to make it work and have real impact. So the first part is that you have to be able to run it in the first place. So the key to being able to run one of these processes is that you have to have sufficient representation of participants from wherever you're trying to find common ground across for the results to have minimum level of legitimacy for anyone to care about them. And so I think in the Russia and Ukraine situation, the question that I don't know the answer to offhand, but would maybe take back to you is, what is the feasibility of getting a reasonably representative groups of participants from both of these sides? If you can do that, then I think that sort of is the absolute minimum sufficient thing to be able to run one of these processes to at least find where common ground on both sides exists. Then if you can do that, the second step is being able to have the diplomatic pathways to push that information into the places where decisions are being made in a way that is perceived as like useful to the parties at hand. And that is where I don't have enough expertise in that particular conflict to know who those folks are that you would be pushing it to, or what the lens is through which they would view it as useful. I think in the case of Israel and Palestine, there was enough people from both sides who wanted, as you saw, ceasefire and exchange of hostages, that there was sort of like this joint goal at the top that was ambient across leaders that meant that there was at least some pressure. And then in this case, quite literally, Trump, who sort of like came in and strong-armed to make it all actually work. That might not be dissimilar from the person who you need to do such a thing in Ukraine and Russia, but I think that like my ignorant outsider analysis is that in the case of Israel and Palestine, the U.S. and Trump, who sort of like came in to like force this into being in its end state, sort of was much larger than either one of those. And I think in the case of Ukraine and Russia, there's a little bit more like military equivalency, which might make it trickier. But yeah, that's a long-winded non-answer because I'm not really sure. In the past, the hardest problem is always those two things, though. If you can get participants from both sides, then you can find common ground. So 100% of the time we've ever run this, we find common ground. I'll note if anyone's in the US, we're actually running it right now on immigration policy, which is a big point of division here. But then the second part is you have to like get it into the place where it is going to have influence. And that is usually one-of-one type scenario that is very dependent on the specific diplomatic processes that are taking place in that region. Although I would start by trying to push the information to the White House if you were able to find common ground among those two groups.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me now?
I can, yep.
Okay, so just thank you. The answer, whatever you wanted to express, it's really inspiring. So, and I will consider. I hope that I will be able to use it as initial instructions. You see, I try to do the peace polls, and I think that it's really, it doesn't sound as hopeless for our conflict. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Elena. I see that we have another hand raised. So in a moment, I will open the microphone for Kevin Luis Damasio. But first, let me just answer here to Corey. He's asking if this call is being recorded. It is, and it's going to be published after in the WAPOR YouTube. So now I'm going to open the microphone to Kevin. Kevin, you should be able to speak now. Kevin, we are waiting for your question.
You're muted, Kevin.
Okay, so while Kevin figures out his microphone, we are still open for questions. I see that we have questions here in the Q&A. Andrew, I'm going to read the first one. So
Cool.
it says, apologies if I missed this. It's a question from Sarah, but aren't members of Hamas being included on the ongoing dialogues?
So I don't want to comment on too much specificity on the details of groups included here. I think like to be honest, we didn't choose to ask or identify that aspect of participants as they joined. And the reason for this is basically honesty and trust. We've learned that you have to be very, very careful of what specifically you ask participants when they are in a scenario where they fear for their lives. That even like the onboarding demographic questions that we might want to ask because we would say like, we want to know if these people are in here, can be the very act of asking them can sort of like create a trust hurting moment that drives out participants, specifically of a particular group. And in this case, as you might imagine, Hamas being actively targeted, should we ask that? And they say yes, we did not expect that they would trust that there was not a way to like find out those people, even though we actually go insanely above and beyond to maintain anonymity. We just didn't ask, and so we just don't know is the honest answer. When we do geographic samples, these are sort of initially gathered through like on the street intercept in these places. And so chances are, but we did not ask, so I can't answer definitively. But good question.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We have a question also here on the chat that I think we missed before. I'm going to read it now. So it says, can you talk about how your initial battery of statements were organized? Were individuals impacted by the conflict involved in this first step to some degree?
Yes. So the very questions that we asked, so the design of this dialogue, which is sort of, you can think of it, it's like somewhere between how you would design like a discussion guide for an interview versus how you would design like a set of poll questions. And so literally the team that was doing the design of these included a Palestinian who at the time was living in occupied territories, and an Israeli who is living in Israel, even in the design process. So we didn't like just design and like throw it to them and say, do you approve, even sort of in the very crafting of them. And so the idea here was that we wanted people who are being affected by it helping to craft it from like the very beginning, or else we believed it would lose legitimacy on down the line.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We have another question by an anonymous attendee. It says, how did you get contact data out of all people interviewed?
We did not get contact data from them. So they were completely anonymous in their participation. So it was sort of came down to distributing a link that they would click on. And then by the time they were in and participating, we did not know anything about them except what they chose to disclose as part of the onboarding polls. And for reasons related to trust that I mentioned and safety, we purposely just try to never ask anything that could actually identify a person. And more so than that, we try to practice statistical anonymity, which means we try to not even ask a number of demographic questions, which could potentially narrow down to a person if you worked really hard to like do the math on it. So we were very blind to it. So we never knew, like even from round to round, we wouldn't necessarily know if it was like the same person coming back and participating.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, Kevin seems to be gone for now. So if there are no other questions, I believe we've overdone a little bit of the time, haven't we? But yes, Andrew, are you still open to answering a few more
Yeah, of
questions if they
course.
arise? Of
Sure.
course. So, okay, so if anyone else would like to ask a question, you can write here on the chat, or you can ask them in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand, and I would open the microphone for you to ask, Andrew.
I think I see Sarah B with the hand raised.
Sarah, you are now allowed to speak. Please feel free to ask your question.
Great, thank you. I was just wondering, it sounds like an incredible amount of networking must have taken place. The results and the methodology, ultimately, they were used at the highest levels by the president, of the U.S. and the head of state of France. Um, I was wondering if you could just say a few words about the networking and how you were able to build these contacts, these abilities to have the methodology used at the highest levels of government.
Yeah, so I think, Sarah, you won't like the answer, which is I didn't. So that was not a skill that I brought or into this. The Alliance for Middle East Peace, or ALMEP, has been developing these networks for years as part of bringing together civil society groups on both sides and using that as a way to help advocate for what civil society groups need at the highest levels of government. And so I think a lot of what made this work successful to the degree that it was the fact that we were working with a group that sort of had set up and built a lot of these relationships across the highest levels of government prior to us actually coming in and helping them run these processes. And so I would say that was, I take 0% credit for any part of that.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think there are no more questions in the Q&A and no other questions in the webinar chat.
Cool.
With that, Andrew, I believe this has been a very good webinar because it's always a good sign when the webinar extends because people have questions to make. So thank you so very much for joining us, and I will remind you that the recording for this webinar is going to be available at WAPOR's YouTube. Make sure to also follow us on our social media. We are very active on Facebook, LinkedIn, and X. And yes, let's thank again Andrew for making time for showing us this very important research.
Awesome. Thank you all. My pleasure.